JonBenet's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
For almost 30 years, one house in Boulder, Colorado has haunted America. A 6-year-old girl, a rambling ransom note nobody can explain, a family torn apart by suspicion before they'd even had time to grieve, and a killer who, as of today, has never been named, never been arrested, and never faced a single day in court. Most true crime stories eventually get an ending. This one hasn't. But what's emerged over the last 2 years isn't a tidy resolution people have been begging for. It's something messier, and in some ways more disturbing. Proof that the system built to find JonBenet's killer has been quietly failing her family for decades, right up to the present moment. This is the real story of where the case stands now, and why Unsolved doesn't even begin to cover it. It was the morning after Christmas, 1996, when Patsy Ramsey came down the spiral staircase of her family's home and found a note sitting on a step. It wasn't a hastily scrawled demand. It ran nearly 3 pages, written in careful, almost theatrical language, asking for a sum of money that happened to be nearly identical to her husband John's annual bonus, a detail that struck investigators as strange from the very first read. Patsy called 911, sobbing, saying her daughter was missing. Police arrived expecting a kidnapping. That single assumption shaped everything that followed, and not for the better. Because officers believed they were dealing with an abduction rather than a homicide, they didn't seal the house the way a killing scene demands. Friends, family, and clergy came and went through the home for hours while a search was organized. JonBenet's own bedroom was cordoned off, but the rest of the house, including the basement, was not treated with anything close to the care a murder scene requires. Hours later, it was JonBenet's father, John, who went down to the basement on his own and found her body in a small, rarely used room. She had been struck in the head and strangled with a garrote fashioned from a cord and a broken paintbrush that belonged to her mother's art supplies. By the time investigators understood they weren't chasing a kidnapper but killer, the scene had already been compromised beyond repair. Think about what that actually means for a case like this. Every step someone takes through a house, every surface they touch, every door they open, has the potential to move, smudge, or destroy the kind of trace evidence a modern lab could use decades later. Fingerprints get overlaid. Fibers get tracked from room to room. DNA that might have pointed clearly to one person gets diluted by the presence of a dozen others who had every right to be there, but no idea they were walking through a crime scene. None of that is anyone's fault in the moment. Grieving parents, panicked friends, and officers working off incomplete information were never trying to sabotage an investigation. But the result was the same regardless of intent. A fragile, one-time-only window of forensic opportunity that closed within hours and never reopened. What followed is now a familiar case study in how not to run a homicide investigation. Patsy and John were interviewed together rather than separately, denying investigators the chance to see whether their accounts of that night would hold up independently. Evidence handling was inconsistent. A rope found near JonBenet's room, unconnected to anything in the house, was never properly tested. Footprints at the scene were never matched to anyone. And the ransom note, written on paper from inside the home, in a style handwriting experts still can't agree on, never led anywhere concrete, despite being examined by some of the best document analysts in the country. For years, public suspicion fell hardest on the family itself. Patsy became a tabloid fixture, painted as either a grieving mother or a calculating one, depending on which network you were watching. Her son Burke, only 9 at the time, was subjected to theories that treated a grieving child as a suspect for the better part of 2 decades. It took until 2008, 12 years after the murder, for Boulder's district attorney to formally clear the Ramsey family based on DNA evidence recovered from JonBenet's clothing that matched none of them. By then, the damage to their name, and to the case itself, was largely done. Patsy never lived to see that exoneration. She died of ovarian cancer in 2006, having spent the last decade of her life as a murder suspect in the eyes of much of the public, without ever being charged. Here's the detail that almost never gets enough attention. Investigators have had unidentified male DNA connected to this case since the late 1990s. It didn't match John, didn't match Burke, didn't match anyone in the extended family. For a while, It was treated as the case's best lead. Then the complications started piling up. The genetic material recovered from JonBenet's clothing turned out to be what forensic scientists call a low-level, mixed sample. Tiny amounts of DNA from more than one source blended together, degraded by 2 decades, sitting in evidence storage. A former Denver district attorney who worked on the case has described the profile as close to an even split between 2 contributors, which is exactly the kind of sample that current genetic genealogy technology still struggles to untangle. It's not that the evidence doesn't exist. It's that the evidence, as it currently stands, may not be clean enough to point conclusively at anyone, which is a very different and much more frustrating problem than simply the killer's DNA is out there waiting to be matched. What makes this frustrating rather than simply hopeless is that the technology capable of solving cases like this genuinely exists. It's just a question of whether this particular sample can survive the process. Forensic genetic genealogy works by taking a crime scene DNA profile and comparing it against genealogy databases full of ordinary people who've submitted their own DNA to trace their ancestry. Even if the actual perpetrator has never taken one of those tests, a distant cousin might have. Investigators can then build outward from that cousin's family tree, narrowing a pool of potential relatives down generation by generation until one person's age, location, and history line up with the crime. It's the method that cracked the Golden State Killer case after more than 40 years, and it's quietly closed dozens of cold cases since. The catch, according to experts who've handled JonBenet's evidence directly, is that the technique needs a clean, single-source DNA profile to work from. A mixed sample, 2 people's genetic material blended into one degraded profile, is a much harder problem, and some forensic specialists have cautioned that the science may simply not be there yet to fully separate the 2 contributors with confidence. That hasn't stopped Jon Ramsey, now in his 80s, from pushing harder than ever. Over the past 2 years, he's spoken publicly, again and again, about wanting Boulder police to hand key evidence to outside private labs capable of forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technique that helped identify the Golden State Killer by tracing distant relatives through public genealogy databases rather than waiting for a direct match. He said he believes the odds of naming his daughter's killer within a matter of months are better than they've ever been, and he's been vocal that if that door isn't fully open yet, it should be. Boulder's police chief has acknowledged, publicly and repeatedly, that the department has submitted both previously untested and retested evidence for modern DNA analysis and has carried out fresh interviews based on tips, describing the case as a continuing top priority for the department. That's real, current movement. What it hasn't produced, at least not publicly, is an announced match, a person of interest, or an arrest. And then, this past summer, the case took a turn nobody was expecting. Not a breakthrough, but a fresh crisis. A former Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst pleaded guilty after an internal review found she had falsified, mishandled, or mismanaged DNA work across a huge number of cases she'd touched during her career at the state's crime lab. Given how central DNA evidence has become to the hope of ever solving JonBenet's murder, the news landed like a gut punch for a family that has spent 30 years being told to trust the process. Boulder Police and the county's district attorney's office both moved quickly to say a review of records found no indication the analyst's misconduct had touched the Ramsey case specifically, since her documented wrongdoing dated to years after the original 1996 testing was completed by an outside lab. Still, the timing could hardly have been worse. It reopened a wound that had never really closed. A case already defined by contaminated crime scenes and questionable evidence handling now had to publicly reassure the country that its DNA custody chain hadn't been compromised all over again. That's the part of this story that rarely makes the true crime highlight reel. It isn't a single dramatic reveal. It's a slow accumulation of institutional failure stacked on institutional failure. A scene that wasn't secured properly in 1996, evidence handling that raised eyebrows for years afterward, and now, 3 decades later, a lab scandal shadowing the very technology that was supposed to finally deliver an answer. Every time the case edges toward resolution, something in the machinery of the investigation itself throws up a new obstacle. Over the decades, plenty of names have surfaced, and none of them have stuck. A man who had played Santa Claus for the Ramsey family days before the murder became an early person of interest after admitting he felt an unusually close attachment to JonBenet, but no evidence ever tied him to the crime itself. A convicted sex offender living in the area reportedly told an acquaintance, shortly after the murder, that he had hurt a little girl, a statement chilling enough to draw serious scrutiny, until his DNA was tested and excluded him entirely. Perhaps strangest of all was a man who traveled from Thailand years later to confess publicly to killing JonBenet, claiming he had loved her and describing details of the crime to reporters, only for investigators to establish he wasn't even in the state at the time, and for his DNA to rule him out as well. Each of these threads generated headlines and theories, and each one, eventually, led nowhere. That pattern, promising lead, extensive investigation, dead end, has defined this case more than any single suspect ever has. There were homegrown theories too, ones that never required a stranger at all. Some armchair investigators pointed to a bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table the morning JonBenet disappeared, undigested fruit that showed up in her autopsy, and Patsy's fingerprints on the bowl itself, evidence that someone in the house had fed her a snack not long before she died, despite both parents saying they had no memory of doing so. From that single detail, entire theories were built about a late-night confrontation between siblings, an accidental injury, and a frantic, misguided cover-up staged to look like a break-in. It's a theory that has circulated in true crime circles for years, and it's one investigators have never been able to fully prove or fully rule out, largely because it runs headlong into that same unidentified male DNA that doesn't belong to anyone in the family. Whatever happened inside that house, the physical evidence has never lined up neatly with any single narrative, family-related or otherwise, which is exactly why the case has resisted a tidy solution for this long. Boulder investigators haven't been shy about the numbers either. Over the life of this case, detectives have logged more than 21,000 tips, letters, and emails, and traveled to nearly 20 states to speak with well over 1,000 people connected to the crime in some way. That's not a department that gave up. It's a department that, by its own account, chased an enormous volume of leads without ever landing on the one that closes the case. A distinction that matters, because unsolved doesn't mean untouched. It means every single one of those threads, so far, has come back inconclusive. So if there's no dramatic arrest to report, what makes this case worse than people assume? It's the scale of what's been lost. It's a crime scene that was never properly secured in the critical first hours. It's physical evidence, like that unexplained rope near JonBenet's bedroom, that was simply never tested at all and can't be meaningfully retested now. It's a family that spent over a decade as public suspects in the eyes of much of the country, built almost entirely on early police missteps and a media appetite for a tidy villain, while the actual killer's trail grew colder by the year. It's a police department that, by its own admission, took a quarter-century to bring in leadership experienced enough to fully modernize the investigation. And now it's a forensic lab scandal casting a shadow over the very DNA testing meant to finally deliver a name. None of that is the same as saying the case can never be solved. Investigators, genetic genealogists, and John Ramsey himself remain genuinely hopeful that with the right lab, the right technique, and enough political will, the unidentified male DNA sitting in evidence storage could eventually be traced through a family tree the way so many other cold cases have been cracked in the past decade. But hope isn't the same as an answer, and after 30 years, JonBenet's family has learned that lesson more times than anyone should have to. It's easy, in a case this tangled, to lose sight of the 6-year-old at the center of it. Before December of 1996, JonBenet Ramsey was, by every account, a bright, funny, endlessly energetic kid who lit up a room and loved being on stage, whether that meant a pageant runway or just performing for her family in the living room. She'd started kindergarten that year at a Boulder elementary school, where teachers remembered her as curious and outgoing, the kind of kid who made friends easily. She adored her older brother, trailed after her parents' attention, and by every measure had a childhood full of comfort and love ahead of her. That's the part of this story that never should have gotten lost in decades of tabloid theories and internet forums. A little girl who deserved a full life, and a family that has now spent 30 years waiting for the truth about the night that took it from her. As it stands today, JonBenet Ramsey's murder remains an open, active investigation. Boulder police say evidence continues to move through forensic labs, that fresh interviews are still being conducted based on tips coming in even now, and that the case remains, in their words, a top priority for the department. John Ramsey continues to advocate publicly and tirelessly for faster, more advanced DNA work, and has said he believes the technology exists today to finally close this case if it's applied aggressively enough. What nobody can offer, honestly, is a timeline. Nearly 30 years in, the family is still waiting for the phone call that tells them a name has finally been attached to that unidentified DNA profile, the same profile that has been sitting, largely unresolved, since the case first went cold. Until that call comes, JonBenet Ramsey remains exactly what she's been for 3 decades. A 6-year-old girl whose murder shocked a nation, whose case exposed just how badly an investigation can go wrong in its earliest hours, and whose killer is, as of this moment, still out there. What do you think really happened in that house on December 26th?